And good evening or good day to you, wherever you are in God's beautiful world. I'm Pastor Calvin Lindstrom with Christian Liberty Homeschools, joined by Mr. Ed Straka, who is the director of Christian Liberty Homeschools. And we have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Scott Postma, who is, sorry, a little technical difficulty there. Dr. Postma is the director of Kepler Education, and we're blessed to have a conversation with him about educational matters. And I'm going to turn things over to Ed for a little more introduction and to lead off the conversation.
All right, great. Well, good evening or afternoon or morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here this evening with Pastor Calvin Lindstrom, Church of Christian Liberty, and Dr. Scott Postma, who is the CEO, president, and one of the founders of Kepler Education. Scott has been in ministry for probably most of his life, it seems like. He's planted, I believe, 2 different churches at times in his ministry, as well as 2 Christian schools. He's been involved in Christian education for well over a quarter of a century and has done a multitude of things. I first met Scott about 5 years ago at an Acton conference in Dallas, Texas, a religion and society conference, and I had the privilege of working for Dr. Postma with Kepler Education years ago, right about the time of the onset of the COVID lockdown, and got to meet him, a lot of his co-workers and students, and God's providence actually had 2 of Pastor Calvin's nephews in my ancient history class, and that was just fabulous. And anyway, we have Scott on this evening. We're going to be talking about a variety of things. And so, Scott, let me just kick off by asking you about your role in Kepler Education and the path that led you there.
Well, thank you, Ed, and thank you, Calvin, for the opportunity to be on and chat with you tonight. Well, as you mentioned, I'm leading Kepler Education at this point as the CEO and started out as one of the co-founders and president. And really, it was born out of a conversation. Kepler Education is born out of a conversation of how do we leverage available technologies today to help spread classical education, make it available, affordable, accessible to families. So one of our key goals in Kepler is that families maintain their agency without having to forfeit, having some of the wisdom and the experience of good teachers. And so leveraging the modern technology to do that is the vision that Kepler was founded on. So today you could summarize saying, Kepler is a marketplace for classical Christian education. And so the path that led here really was just a vision to fulfill, the Great Commission, really, and the liberal arts. So how do we get the gospel and a good Christian education out to as many as possible, or make it accessible to as many as possible?
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, okay, obviously including Kepler Education, but expanding beyond it, how do you see classical education in terms of the future? Do you think it's here to stay, or is it just something that's been trending for the last 10 to 15 years?
That's a fabulous question. I want to believe it's here to stay. As all things, the potential for there to be some sort of fad in the movement or people catching on, that's always, possible in a limited sense. But I'm going to suggest, or I'm thinking that this is probably here to stay for the long haul for a couple of reasons. First of all, being that, it's classical Christian education. It's rooted in the gospel. We might even say that classical education is rooted both in the gospel and the liberal arts. And wherever the gospel has gone, the academy's always followed. So what classical education is really doing today is recovering something that has been timeless in the advancement of the gospel and Christianity. And so I think, in one sense, the renewal and revival of classical education is a response to the modernism that we're seeing so prevalent today, and actually seeing kind of, it come to its end, its full end. The end of sin is always death, and we're seeing the death of a culture that has been rooted in the autonomous self and the rejection of God. And so when we are, as some call it, building in the ruins, or repairing in the ruins, I think something in classical education is fundamental to the human nature, especially as it's animated by Christianity. So in that sense, I think it's really here to stay.
Interesting. Well,
And,
that's good. We certainly need something. Pastor, anything you want to add or ask?
so Scott, the liberal mindset just sees it as, we just need more money in education. If we could just spend another $300 billion, every child could read at fifth grade level. Describe the modern state of modern America, especially in terms of education, and the challenges perhaps that you'll see Christian education will face because of the breakdown in culture. I mean, it's an opportunity, but maybe there's some challenges there also.
Well, there's definitely some challenges, but I think if finances, if it was just a matter of putting more money into it, then by now everybody should be educated and the problems should all be solved in society. But we've seen just the opposite. The more money people are throwing at it, the less effective it is. But that's really because it's rooted in, we talk about worldview, and I want to maybe qualify what I mean by that, but it's because it's rooted in this false narrative that there could be some kind of a secular worldview, that education could ever be neutral, and it never is, and never can be. And what we see, I think, in the modern demise, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's kind of the end of sin. When there's a narrative in the humanities, or in Christian humanism, if I can, that might be an offsetting or an off-putting term to some people if they don't understand it. But in a Christian humanism, there's a threefold stage that we go through, and we can see this in Romans 1 verses 18 and following, where man attempts to become autonomous from God. And in attempting to become autonomous from God, there is this division within himself, this breakdown. God gives him over to a futile mind. This brings about a breakdown in society, because man becomes anti social in a very particular way, displaced. Society breaks down, and this is sort of the cycle that we're seeing happen. And this is, exactly what Scripture tells us would happen. So modern education attempts to throw money, take this idea of removing the humanness from education to make people mere technicians, but this vacuum that's created in what's perceived to be secular will always assume some sort of religious bent. It will always assume some sort of idolatry, if we're looking at it, as we rightly should from a Christian perspective. One way, if listeners are familiar at all with C.S. Lewis's cosmic trilogy, we see this happen in his final novel, in That Hideous Strength, where, in the name of science, we're all going to be, secular, and it's follow the science, and they assume this demonic, sort of influence. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in our culture today happening. That's not real popular to say that today, because you sound, like some kind of religious nut, but all men are worshiping. You can run, but you can't hide, right? You're going to worship something or someone, or as Bob Dylan said, you got to serve somebody. It's just not going to, it's never going to be neutral.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And do you see classical Christian education playing a role in helping to facilitate true reformation or revival?
I think it does, and I think it's true for a couple of reasons. In one sense, in the revival of classical education, there is a transcendent effect between Christian traditions. In other words, this has given us a platform to think about culture and where we're always reforming. It's given us a conversation, a way to introduce the need for Christ, being Lord of all things in culture, despite maybe some differences that are important differences, but in a culture, a secular culture where, in a secular culture where it's demonic. It's like being in the military in some sense, where you have the rival, different, got Air Force and Army and Marines, and rivaling, but in a war, we all come together because we're on the same side, kind of thing. So I think there's this revival within Christianity to come back to the roots and look at what's important. And so bringing that back around is one of the important features that classical Christian education brings. And again, I want to be real careful, because that doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that there's a breakdown in our traditions or important doctrines, but there is this sort of collaboration with Christ being central that's important in our culture right now. The other part, I think, is the revival of the liberal arts, a proper way of seeing education of a human being that is reflective of the Trinity, of the cosmos, of all that God's created. And there's a great statement that John of Salisbury from the 1100s, this is the 12th century, and he says that any education that does not reflect the harmony of the Trinity and the harmony of the cosmos and the harmony of the human soul ought to be public enemy number one. And that's exactly what modern education is a rejection of that harmony. And so I think the revival of classical education is both a revival of the gospel in culture and a revival of this right kind of education that reflects God accurately.
Amen.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Speaking to your earlier comment on C.S. Lewis, I remember his Abolition of Man essay and the discussion about the conditioners, and that there come a time in history where there would be a group of elites, the conditioners, and it would be those men and women who would set the course of history. And rather than freeing man, from nature and all of that, all of humanity would be shaped for the worse by those people. And those elites are not anchored in any transcendent value. When you think of Christ as the fixed reference point in the universe, of him and through him and by him are all things, through him all things hold together. It's a universe in free fall, intellectually, morally, scientifically, and all of that, plus our modern intellectual soup of postmodernism and deconstructionism everywhere. It's like this horrific soup that has no form or function, and it's just like floating around and oozing out, and it's toxic, right? And that's seems to be what we're living in now, right?
Well, absolutely, and you're talking about this kind of this soup, this sort of everything. It's malleable. There's no form. There's no anchor to it. And as you mentioned, abolition of man. And I was talking about the that hideous strength. These are the same. This is the same principle. One in a sort of literary form, and one in an essay form or in a lecture form. But it's the same principle. And Lewis goes on to there, and he talks about the fact that these elites, in using things like education and reform, there's no limits to that. So it just continues to be continual soup. So there's no end to it. And as long as as long as they're in control, as long as there's power, and that's exactly what postmodernism is this will to power. And so
Yes.
there's no place for this to end and stop and say, yes, we've achieved something. It's just a way of continually, dominating and shaping a culture in a way that serves them best.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. With postmodernism, they know what's wrong with everyone else, in their opinion, of course, but they really have no plan for the future. So, yeah, we'll just grab some Marxism for now.
Yeah.
And they don't realize they're essentially the offspring philosophically of Marxism, just further down the gene pool, as it were. Um, you know, you had earlier mentioned about the different, I guess, streams of classical education, and I've often wondered about that myself. Granted, we're a reasonably new movement. What is it? Would you
Yeah.
say roughly 20 years old at best? And
Yeah, mid 80s maybe. Yeah.
And so, okay, so we're talking about 30. And so, there's all different type of branches of it. Some of them, even though they have a full-blown curriculum of ancient, medieval, and modern, they seem married and buried into the ancient Greco-Roman world, right? And there's a lot of rhetoric that's tossed around. I know when this is a decade ago, but after about 2 years into it, I began to see that it seemed like the purpose of many of the classical education schools is just to perpetuate itself. And I had a conversation about 6 months ago with another gentleman, well, leave unnamed, of a different organization, and basically talked about, the plan is to try to educate kids into even their freshman and sophomore year, have them go to a mainline university, and then they're going to come back and teach at classical Christian schools. Now, intrinsically, there's nothing wrong with that statement or that goal. But what concerned me is like that seemed to be the length, breadth, and extent of it. And it's like we're just going to reproduce classical education scholars and somehow the world will be well then. And, if you search for truth, goodness, and beauty, it seems to me that it's going to apply in all areas of society and really impact your sociology, right? Could you speak
Right.
to that at all?
Well, I think if we become the self-licking ice cream cone, that we have failed to recognize, the value and the importance of what classical education is all about. And if we think of classical education as the recovery of I again hesitate to use the word worldview because that brings its own baggage, but in a sense, a Christ-centered worldview that has a liberal understanding. In other words, I think inherent in Christianity is the ability to ask questions in a Socratic fashion, because the truth there's no competitor to the truth, and we don't have to be afraid of that. But classical education can't be an end in itself. It can't be, the goal, but rather it is a means of recovering, a way of thinking about the world, a way of thinking about life and nature, that Christ is Lord, and I say that that's super important to understanding the classical movement, because Christianity is what animated the classical tradition that brought about the success, or what the West became, in terms of the Western tradition. So without Christianity, we would still be, Platonist, groping and Aristotelian grabbing, if you will. But without Christianity, the gospel is what answers those questions. I'm always reminded, I think this is probably one of the most fascinating aspects of it. Of course, we could all look at Acts 17, for example, where the Apostle Paul goes to the Areopagus and, he quotes from Epimenides and Eros and some of the other poets. And so a lot of people get excited and think about classical education that way. And that's one potential use of it. But there's another sense in which, when we talk about classical education, we're seeing the way in which the gospel answers these questions that virtuous pagans were striving to answer. And one of those examples is in Plato's Republic, and I'm just giving a real brief summary here, but where he unpacks and he makes this city out of speeches, and we're considering what does justice look like, the city being the soul writ large. And he makes this concluding statement where he says that if you can find this kind of philosopher king who's willing to go down into the cave, suffer the most injustice without ever being unjust himself, that is the one who should rule over us, this kind of philosopher king. Now, of course, Plato didn't have Christ in view there, not the way we would understand it, but we can see easily as we reflect the way in which the gospel answers these questions. So I think one of the recoveries of classical education is the ability to see the way in which the gospel has animated the West, and where, to take Kuyper's statement that, modern humanism is cut flower, right? We're taking away we're trying to keep the flower and get rid of the root, which is Christianity. I think the revival of classical education shows us the way in which the gospel animates and brings about a culture that is healthy and human flourishing, while honoring God, and not in the maybe Italian Renaissance way in which man becomes the measure of all things, but the way in which man's the middle of things. So I think if we recover classical education to that end, that's where we're going to see the most success. I think that's where it's important, but not as an end in itself, not the self-licking ice cream cone.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, to me, it's like you certainly don't want to politicize your classrooms, and that's always a danger in political science classes in all kind of schools, right? On the other hand, we cannot escape the fact theologically and philosophically, frankly, what a person believes about God, man, law, time, and hope, that's going to affect the family, the church, the state, and the economy. And those four categories, what you have to say about the family, the church, the state, and the economy is going to determine what type of civilization you can build. Right. And if you say, well, let's not talk about this, let's not talk about that, and I've been in schools that are like that, it's like, okay, then you've essentially put nothing in the room swept clean of the demon, to go to the Gospel of Luke. And so, okay, you've just turned over the economy to the humanist, right? And you've just turned over politics to the humanist. And it seems to me, if we have the greatest minds from the ancient Greco-Roman world, and then from there you go into the City of God by Augustine, who speaks to everybody in every civilization, including far back, the Chaldean world, the Persians, the Egyptians, you name it. Augustine wrote about everyone, and essentially, philosophically and theologically destroyed a lot of those ancient movements that were still extant 1700 years ago. But Christianity destroyed them, which is why when I would teach the City of God, even for Kepler, when I worked for you years ago, Scott, a lot of the kids are saying, well, who were these people? And I said, well, you don't know about them anymore because Christianity just destroyed them intellectually, and then within a century, no one believed it anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And right. So to me, it's inescapable that Christ is either the Lord of all, or he's only the Lord of bits and pieces. And then by default, we essentially become escapists, like Buddhists staring at our navel and just waiting for time to go by. And, that's a terrible thing. And it's certainly not a gospel that is going to captivate the hearts and minds of teenagers and young people in their 20s in this day when everything around them is falling apart, right? Mm-hmm. So, Pastor, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, Scott, it's, the work of Christian education is like planting seeds. The parable of the sower is how I like to see it. Some of those seeds produce great fruit. Some of those seeds are eaten up by the wicked one. So how do you see some of that fruit from perhaps even your efforts or from the broader movement? Do you see some of that, perhaps the harvest of some of that planting even in our own age?
I do. Maybe one of the places that we can look and see the fruit of some of this is the building of civilization in certain communities, the building of businesses and family in a biblical sense, and where we have seen some of this are approaching culture, approaching politics, actually works. And in the community that I'm a part of, we've got to see that firsthand in a lot of ways. The problem is I think that a lot of the world doesn't get to see some of this because of social media and the way that the whole postmodernist construction is not to have dialogue about what's best for human beings, but really to try and conquer that and cover up anything that is going to, compete with their narrative. So I think for a lot of people, they don't get to see that. But when you see businesses, families, communities succeeding and flourishing, you can always go back and you see the root of that being in the gospel, in Christian community. And to add a little bit to kind of what Ed said and tie it to this statement or this course of the conversation, there's two ways I think that politics gets misused, and like two ditches maybe we could fall into. The one side is to ignore them and say, well, the gospel doesn't, we don't need to be political, for the gospel. Well, that would be a false statement on one side. The other is to think that, that politics is the end, that's the savior, that's what's going to save us. And so we have to go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, then you're just like the Marxists, where, power flows from the barrel of a gun, and, we're going to solve it.
Yeah, but we can't just end with, okay, so the gospel. I said this earlier, but the academies always follow the gospel, and downstream from that is always the building of political, of societies. That's what politics is, right? That's the building of civilization and how we live in harmony and community with one another, which is part of the whole point of the restoration that the gospel is doing. And so if we don't have that, then we're failing to be honest with what the gospel is supposed to do. And I'm always reminded, I came into Christianity as a young adult, but into a particular stream of Christianity where the kind of the left behind pre-tribulation, rapture and things, which sort of has the gospel is going to go out into the world and then it's going to fail and we got to get rescued anyway. Whereas the Great Commission, if we believe the Great Commission, then the gospel is going to be followed up. The flowering of the gospel is the flourishing of humanity as God intended us to be restored, in that. So we can't escape politics. Education is the shaping and forming of a political people. And so, we just have to have that right balance, I guess. And I don't mean balance in the sense that we're like on a tightrope walk, but understanding that politics isn't the end goal, but we don't leave it off. It's part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because essentially any political theory should flow from the worldview, the sociology, and the daily lives and intellectual and moral norms of your society. And so, because really the purpose of a legal system, right? Law sets the relationship between people, places, and things. It allows some things to flourish openly. Other things it pushes out and says that's not allowed. And a lot of Christians don't understand the simplicity of that. Law binds and keeps safe your civilization, or it can destroy it, depending on what standard you base it on.
Well, law is moral, right? I mean, you cannot. People say you can't legislate morality, but you can't legislate immorality and expect good results. And I'm of the mind, that if Christ is Lord of all, and I don't use that if as though I'm uncertain, if Christ is Lord, as Kepler said, of every square inch, if Christ is Lord, then any civilization or any philosophy or any education that is built on anything other than that, then Camus had it right? Then the only philosophical question left to answer is just why not kill yourself, right? I mean, because what's the meaning? What's the purpose? Why sit here and suffer? And the only other answer to that is gospel. And so classical education, classical Christian education, and sometimes, if this could get too nuanced, but sometimes I think classical Christian is almost redundant if we understand classical correctly, because, Christianity is what animated the classical world and brought about what flourished. Because the Greeks, they hit a roadblock. They, were thankful for a lot of what they proposed, but like Dante showed us, there's only so far that Virgil can take us, and then we're at an impasse. We need Christ.
Yeah, yeah. That essay by Camus is terrifying. Suicide or recovery, and
Yeah.
that's the ultimate end of things. And then, so for the thumb sucking babies, they're going to take the easy way out, and there will be other people who, the alpha males who will look to Nietzsche and the will to power, and then you have the tyrant, right? And right out of Thucydides, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must.
And that's what we're seeing. I think in some ways, that's exactly what we're seeing in the culture today. To avoid, the nausea of nihilism that Nietzsche talked about. The only thing left is that will to power. To force on the rest of culture to, we're going to be the strong man, we're going to be the overman, and implement. That's why there's no conversation. That's why there's no flourishing. That's why there's no building. It's just the tyrannical forcing.
Yeah. Well, Scott, any events this summer with Kepler that you would want to share?
Sure. Well, thank you for that opportunity. We, as I mentioned earlier, as we got started tonight, with Kepler, our goal is to serve families and allow, the support of them keeping their agency while also giving them access to great teachers like, Ed is taught on our platform before. And so we have a lot of great teachers. And so one of the things that we've done in helping try to promote, get the word out, is to go into a kind of a way into different regions and promote classical Christian education through various conferences. And in our attempt, what we've focused on is collaboration over competition. So there's a lot of other groups doing great things in classical education. And so what we want to do is go into a region of the world. This year, we're in 3 different regions of the country and hosting 1 or 2 day conferences that are, nominal costs. We bring in lunch, and so we have 1 in Louisiana, 1 in Arkansas, and 1 in Massachusetts this year, where we'll do 1 or 2 day conferences teaching, encouraging, and equipping folks in classical education, helping them see what are the various tools that are available to families to classically educate their children.
Fascinating.
Scott, speak to the consortium a little bit. That's a fascinating media platform that Kepler has, and both the written version as well as the blogs. Speak to that to our audience a little bit.
Sure. So our class, you can learn more about it at theclassicalconsortium.com. And the consortiums, again, are not just, we have the 1 day conferences, but we have a blog, we have a podcast. We are publishing a journal twice a year now. So we have our next issue is coming out June 1st. It drops. And so we are just, using this platform as a way to help classical Christian teachers, educators, homeschoolers, and families be able to find resources, make connections in their area. And really, again, the whole goal of this is recognizing that there are differences from a mere Christian sort of approach. How do we stay collaborative as long as possible in such an important movement in recovering the culture where Christ is Lord? And then we can work with people who, maybe we would attend a different church or have some different theological differences. But in this endeavor, Christ is Lord. The gospel animates Western culture. And can we work together to bring about the revival and recovery of a classical, liberal arts pedagogy? So that's what the consortiums are all about.
Very nice. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time, and we hope our listeners will learn more about your work as well as our own work. We've been involved in Christian education for many years by God's grace, my prayer, I think for all of our prayer would be, let's see Christian education double and then triple over the next 5 to 10 years, and let the exodus continue. One statistic that Ed and I maybe heard recently was 40% of Americans are considering training their children at home in some way.
Wow.
Not that they're going to do it, but you know what? With the breakdown comes opportunity, and I pray the Lord uses it in a mighty way for His glory, the salvation of many souls and the building of His kingdom. So,
Amen.
Scott, we partner together and pray that the Lord richly blesses you. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Scott. Regards to your lovely wife and Big Joff and Daniel and the Roman Rhodes and Kepler crew. Tell them I miss them all.
I sure will. Thanks, Ed. Thank you, Calvin.
Sure. Bye-bye.
God bless.